Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you had a fantastic break. I hope that you did some fun stuff, that you got out, that you saw family. We had a good time. It's nice here. Allison and I went out to the Poconos and tried to enjoy ourselves. And I'm feeling very much refreshed and ready to go. So I'm happy to see you, and I hope that you're ready to get back into it. We are dealing with foreign aid, and foreign aid is an important topic because we start to consider that question: can the West be a force for good in developing countries? And can foreign aid buy growth? Is it possible to promote development through these transfers from one country to another? This is a really important question because it involves the international community, and we begin to consider a a variety of organizations beyond the state that have an interest and a stake in promoting development. And so, what we'll be doing this week is addressing this topic first from the vantage point of foreign aid as a concept, how we define it and understand it, how we debate it and discuss it. We'll talk about some of the different views, some of the contrasting views of foreign aid. Then eventually we'll discuss the political economy of foreign aid and get into questions about the key actors, the interests, the consequences. We'll talk about foreign aid as a system, and we'll approach foreign aid and analyze foreign aid in the same way that we have the other topics in the class. And along the way, I'll be incorporating you and asking you to engage as much as possible. As always, I expect that you participate and that you be a part of this as we go along. I present the information, but I'd like you to interact as much as possible. So I do have some questions and a variety of different things that we'll do towards that end. And so without further ado, let's get started. Foreign aid is kind of like a punching bag sometimes because there are very strong views about the functions and the benefits or the negative consequences potentially of transferring money to developing countries. And oftentimes in cartoons and in popular discussion, the critics of foreign aid suggest that countries have malign motives or they have these sort of hidden motivations. They ultimately want to take control, or there's something that lies beyond development and growth for the recipient that motivates the choice to give foreign aid to that developing country. And more recently, one of the countries that's fallen into discussion is China. And many debate the role and the functions and the potential benefits or drawbacks of Chinese foreign aid to developing countries, particularly in places in Africa. And in this class, we've talked a lot about Africa and the experience of African countries during colonialism, during the independence period, during the post-independence period, and all the way up to the present. And so one of the questions that comes up in this discussion about foreign aid is, what is the motivation of Chinese foreign aid, and what are the potential benefits or maybe some of the drawbacks, and how much foreign aid is China giving, and how much foreign aid does the United States give by comparison, and in what in general is the sort of political economy of foreign aid. These are all questions that we'll consider, but before we start, I'd like you to open up as much as possible, and if you have a strong opinion or view on this issue, to consider the different viewpoints and consider the different perspectives, because it is a discussion and it is a debate. It's not a settled issue by any stretch. In this discussion, we'll address the concept of foreign aid. We'll talk about the history of foreign aid. As I said before, we'll follow up with a discussion of the political economy of foreign aid. And then ultimately, we want to address that big question, which is aid effective? Can aid promote development? Can it bring about economic growth? Can it contribute to the social advances and the human advances that we associate with development and that we associate with human capabilities more generally? This is a key question because, again, we're beginning to consider the role of those international organizations in those actors that lie beyond the boundaries and the borders of those developing countries that mainly have been our focus until now. So this discussion has us thinking about the role of countries like the United States and other powers that may have an interest in promoting development through foreign aid. And we want to discuss and understand those motives and really, first and foremost, what foreign aid is. And so the technical term is actually official development assistance, ODA. When you see that acronym or that term in government documents, it's referring to what we essentially call foreign aid in simpler terms. Official development assistance can actually take a variety of different forms, and there are many different categories that I'll discuss with you momentarily. But we think of all of these, generally speaking, as examples of foreign aid. And when we define foreign aid, we're really thinking fundamentally about a transfer from one government to another. And we're talking about sovereign governments, states, right? Countries, not state and provincial governments or federal and local governments. We're talking about national governments, transfers from one to another. And formally, we would define these transfers as the voluntary transfer of public resources from one government to another, or to a non-governmental organization or international organization, with at least one goal being the improvement of the human condition in the receiving country. Now, there's a lot of complexity buried in this definition. This definition implies that foreign aid can be transferred from one government to another directly, or it can be transferred from one government to a non-governmental organization or international organization, some third actor in the international sphere that acts as a sort of mediator or sort of middle person or middle actor, and in turn sends that foreign aid along to recipient or receiving countries. And hovering around these transfers is a single or partial goal of improving the human condition in the receiving country. And I say single or partial because it's complicated. Foreign aid is dispersed for a variety of different reasons. And what is technically ODA or official development assistance can be entirely driven by the goal of improving the human condition, or it can be partly driven by. It can be combined with military objectives or other objectives that might change the overall objective and take away from the exclusive purpose of improving the human condition. The point is that ODA can at least be partly motivated by a desire to improve the human condition or advance development. And if you're sensing that this gets complicated and that there might be a variety of motives, you're correct. And as always, we need to understand these things in terms of the motivations and in terms of the different objectives, in terms of the actors and the choices and the interests that come into consideration when we talk about these decisions by one government to give money to another, either directly or through an international organization. So this is data that's a little bit old, but the point that I want to show you doesn't necessarily relate to the raw numbers. It relates to the sheer extreme variation in and wealth in the international sphere. In the world, we know that there are extraordinary variations among developing countries in terms of their income. We know that there are lower income developing countries, there are lower middle income developing countries, there are middle income developing countries, and there are upper middle income developing countries. And then there are those developing countries that develop beyond the categories associated with developing and become high income countries, like, for instance, South Korea. But when we consider all of those variations between high income countries and low income countries, you can see the radical extremes between, say, countries like the Congo, where income is so scarce that there's almost none of it, and countries like Monaco, where high income figures dominate, and from year to year, GDP per capita is extraordinarily high for the average person. So there's tremendous variation, and we should make no mistake when we discuss foreign aid that the transfers that we consider are primarily from these rich countries to these poor countries. And so when we talk about the objective of improving the human condition, we fundamentally are referring to economic and social and human development, and often chiefly first and foremost, economic development and human development, meeting those basic needs, helping to meet those basic needs in places where basic needs cannot be met. So income inequality must be the context with which we understand foreign aid in the radical variation between rich and poor countries. But when it comes to those types of foreign aid and the transfers from rich to poor countries, there are many. And really, the complexity of foreign aid as a concept is really unmistakable. And it begins to be difficult to understand foreign aid without distinguishing between different types when we consider that different forms of foreign aid can be radically different and really unrecognizable when looked at next to each other. So for instance, we can distinguish between grants that countries can obtain, concessional loans that might be loans based on certain requirements that are met by the recipient country. There can be aid that is conditional upon meeting certain conditions that are different from loans and different from grants. And aid can also be freely given and not tied or associated with any conditions. That would be untied aid. There can be project-focused foreign aid, which is focused on specific types of developments or specific types of investments. There can be budget support or supplementary income for governments that they can use to pad their general budget that they decide on a yearly basis after determining different budgetary priorities. There's humanitarian aid, which is chiefly about supporting individuals and communities and countries that are in crisis or that have experienced some sort of an emergency. There is development aid, which is typically not associated or contingent upon some emergency or some humanitarian crisis, but is targeted at improving social or human conditions according to certain indicators that are chosen as the means of evaluating the use of the aid. There's the distinction between economic aid and military aid. Economic aid is typically aid that is targeted at specific kinds of economic developments or investments. Military aid is aid that is targeted at the military. And these are very different kinds of aid. And these different categories begin to suggest that foreign aid is not a monolithic concept by any stretch. In fact, the term foreign aid is misleading because there's a huge difference, for example, between sort of humanitarian or developmental aid, like funding for schools or community centers like here in Central America, and military aid or funding for the military or the national police or the security forces as part of an effort to improve security, improve law and order, establish a stronger presence for the central government. There's a radical difference between social and developmental aid and, say, military aid or aid for the security forces. And in fact, during the Trump administration in Central America, there was significant reduction in foreign aid to countries like El Salvador. And those reductions were felt both along the category of military aid and categories related to developmental aid that would have gone to, say, education or community projects or funding for social or human purposes. There was a reduction in aid across the board. Now, what was striking was that these reductions in aid were experienced at the same time that conditions deteriorated in those countries regarding security, regarding the ability of the police and the military and the security forces to ensure order. Incomes were falling. These countries are in a very poor condition, and they are developing countries that are very much in need of aid. And so this little vignette suggests that not only is there a significant difference between different types of aid, but that changes in foreign aid can be associated with changes in the political environment, changes in the administration. It's also notable that during this time, the Trump administration also designated a variety of Central American countries as safe third countries, or as countries that would be considered safe or appropriate places to keep potential migrants or individuals seeking asylum or refuge in the United States. So these issues are very much intertwined. And the point that I want to make to you is that in developing countries, the circumstances on the ground often demand a variety of different forms of aid. And the different forms that aid takes can be radically different indeed, based upon the circumstances being addressed with that particular form of aid. And so the difference between education and development and military aid is quite striking. Now, the OECD, which is an organization that we're familiar with in this class, and it is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, actually distinguishes between military and non-military aid. Now, because of this radical difference between different types of aid, the OECD defines foreign aid or official development assistance, as we've called it formally, as non-military grants and net disbursements of concessional loans that have at least a 25% grant element. Okay, so what this is showing you is that first and foremost, some international organizations of notable importance, like the OECD, define foreign aid as non-military aid because of the important distinction between military and human or social development functions. And then moreover, they establish a threshold for what the net disbursement of that aid has to be in order for it to be aid, or what share of that transfer must be a concessional loan or some sort of foreign aid or grant for it to be foreign aid. And the OECD says that it's 25%. So in other words, for each transfer, or at least we'll think of it as a transfer, if that transfer is to constitute foreign aid, at least 25% of it needs to be a concessional loan or some kind of grant that is of a non-military nature. This implies then that in any given transfer, a large share of it might not even be targeted at improving the human condition. According to the OECD, 75% of it could be for military purposes or for non-pro poverty or human welfare purposes. They could be strategic or related to some sort of diplomacy that doesn't directly impact the human condition. If 25% of it, however, does and is considered part of a grant element, it does qualify as foreign aid. So this gives you a good sense of just how this can break down in practice. A large proportion of a transfer can actually be non-foreign aid, and the transfer itself can still be foreign aid. This suggests also that few transfers are going to be 100% foreign aid, right? Are any transfers entirely foreign aid? Doubtfully, based upon this definition. Seems as though the OECD expects that most transfers will be only a fraction foreign aid, defined in terms of non-military grants, concessional loans, or grants. Now the question arises, who gives foreign aid and how much are they giving? And this is the first important question for us in a series of questions that we'll address that help us to think about the key actors, the key interests, the stakeholders, what kinds of motivations might be leading them to become involved in dispersing foreign aid. And it may not surprise you to learn that essentially every Western industrialized, developed nation, from the United States to Greece, gives foreign aid. And it's quite frequent practice. And the United States in particular seems to be associated with foreign aid and the dispersing of foreign aid through these transfers that the OECD is defining as at least 25% non-military concessional loans or grants. But developing countries themselves in middle-income countries are also highly involved in dispersing foreign aid. So for instance, Brazil, China, and other middle-income countries like Turkey are increasingly involved in giving out foreign aid. And China is one that we've already mentioned, but China is particularly active in places in Africa, where they've also been very busily engaged in infrastructure building associated with their One Belt Road project, which we've discussed in class already. And in general, middle-income countries are increasingly a part of the foreign aid game when it comes to who is actually giving. But what's interesting is that there can be substantial disagreement about the generosity of countries and just how much they're actually giving. And it may not surprise you that where you stand depends on where you sit. There are different ways of measuring generosity. There are different ways of thinking about generosity and different ways of gauging just how much countries are giving. Now, as always, in a class on development, we want to think about outcomes in a variety of different ways. And we want to use a sophisticated approach to understanding and evaluating these issues. And so in this case, we will think about the two main views of donor generosity. And these are the main views from the literature and from the debate about foreign aid. And when we ask, for example, can foreign aid buy growth, it becomes a question then of, well, what do we mean by foreign aid and what do we mean by generosity? And the first and most, well, actually, I shouldn't say that really, because these these views are used equally frequently. But the first view is to think about donor generosity in terms of just the total dollar amount, the net, the US dollar amount in billions. In this case, we're looking at 2019 US dollars. And if you look at donors and you array them according to the net disbursement or the total foreign aid dispersed, you find that the United States gives the most. And they give about roughly 33, 34 billion in 2019. Now, next up is Germany. Germany gave about 24 billion in 2019. The United Kingdom gave about 19 billion in 2019. Japan gave about 16 billion. France gave about 12 or 13 billion. Sweden gave about 5 billion. The Netherlands gave about 5 billion. Italy gave about 4.9 billion. Canada, 4.8 billion, and so on and so forth. You can see then that a lot of these advanced countries that we normally think about as the developed countries are on here. And really, what's notable, I think, what's most notable is that the United States is at the top. And I only point this out to you because I want to contrast this with what I'll highlight here when we examine our second view. Now, that first view is based on using the net total disbursement, the total dollar amount given in foreign aid. The second view is to look at the amount of foreign aid given as a percent of gross national income. This is basically a way of looking at foreign aid as a proportion of national income. Whereas this one is about the total dollar amount, the total net. This is about the proportion of income dispersed as foreign aid. And you notice that we get a very, very different result. Luxembourg ranks as the highest. Luxembourg is the country that gives the largest proportion of its national income as foreign aid. The United States, comparatively, is much, much, much lower. You'll see that whereas the United States was first when we used the net dollar amount, the United States is 23rd where we use the grant equivalent as a percentage of GNI or national income. These are competing perspectives. On the one hand, some say that, well, we should really consider foreign aid disbursement in terms of the total volume of foreign aid, because that accounts for the capacity of the country to give foreign aid. On the other hand, others say we should really think about foreign aid in terms of the proportion of national income given as foreign aid, because then that's a better measure of the sort of overall amount of the income that's being given, right? How much are they actually sacrificing based on what they make? These are different views. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And I would ask you, before we continue, which view of donor generosity is a more effective view, or which view is better at capturing the idea of foreign aid, in your opinion?
I would find the view of looking at just the pure dollar amount, like the $35 billion in comparison to looking at a percentage of GNI. I think it's still a better comparison because, I mean, we're still talking relatively small amounts, I would say, in comparison to how much we really make as a country and how much we potentially could contribute. But we still, contribute a lot, right, to all these countries, still compared to the other ones listed. Like I don't necessarily see China on there, but they also might not be doing foreign aid in the same regard.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Max, it sounds like in your opinion, from your vantage point, like the total volume of aid is what counts, right? Like if giving dollars is what matters, shouldn't we look at how many dollars are given?
Yeah, I think it's more important because sure, the Netherlands and Switzerland, they have a higher coefficient, but they contributed, a fraction of what we did.
Yeah, in terms of that, in terms of the net, that is to say, but someone could say relative to their income, they may have contributed more. But this is why it's interesting, right? Because there are different views, and we can easily see an argument for both sides. Let's hear from some other folks. Which view is the better view of foreign aid, or which one is a more effective way of measuring foreign aid or generosity, in your opinion? I want you all to keep thinking about that question. I'm going to double back and address a comment that Karen made. And this is an important question. Karen said, I find it unusual that middle income countries like Brazil give aid. And that is an interesting fact, isn't it? And I think that, while not giving too much away, part of the story is that Brazil aspires to be a superpower and to be a great power. And they understand that establishing these relationships, even if it involves voluntarily handing over aid to some of these countries, it's advantageous for them. And getting involved in these relationships and building these relationships, even these relationships of dependence potentially, could be beneficial for Brazil insofar as it aspires to become a power. And you can see a similar dynamic, I think, with China and Turkey. And this gets to what we'll discuss later in this lecture this week, which is the political economy of foreign aid. Why is it that countries are giving foreign aid? What motivates them to hand over money and potentially expect nothing in return? Well, there might be something that they expect in return. It might just be that what they get in return is more nuanced and it might have more to do with a calculation or a kind of relationship that they want to establish. But this is something we'll explore more as we go along. For now, I want to come back to this question and I want to ask you again, which view do you think is a better view or better measure of donor generosity? Looking at a percentage of GNI or looking at the total dollar amount? And maybe in particular, does anyone think that looking at the percentage of GNI is a better measure or a more accurate view of donor generosity?
I think the graph on the right, the USD billion, makes more sense, but I don't know if I'm just being biased because it's measured in US dollars and obviously the United States, it makes more sense for them to be like, to rank in the largest numbers. But then it also makes sense to look at the percentage of GNI because I lost my train of thought, but I think the USD billion graph makes more sense.
That's okay, Karen. This is kind of a tricky question, and it makes us think about, how are we thinking about aid and giving? And do we think about giving in terms of the proportion of our income that we give? Or do we think about aid in terms of the total amount that we give? And for those of you who've ever been to church, for example, and who've ever tithed or given to the church, you know that sometimes the most touching stories of giving are those stories about, the little old lady or the little old man who had a very strict fixed income, but gave a huge share of their income to the church or to the community or to whatever, right? And in those cases, we seem to be appealing to this notion that giving is fundamentally about sacrifice. But in those other instances, we sometimes emphasize the generosity of billionaires or rich people who give what looks like a large amount of dollars, but that frankly isn't that much money for them. Like the United States, you'll see in a moment that interestingly enough, although the United States does give a lot in terms of the dollar amount, the actual share of the income generated by the United States that the US gives as foreign aid is quite small. And so it's not really a sacrifice. But I just want you to think about and kind of reckon with the challenge of conceptualizing aid and thinking about generosity, and then how that maps onto this disagreement and this debate about, well, are we using the net or are we using the share? And how does that choice impact the way we think about and the way we evaluate and analyze foreign aid? So I'll read some of these comments that have been shared with me via the chat. Rady says, I agree with Max. Looking at foreign aid in terms of total money given as a whole, instead of looking at the amount they can potentially give. Even if they give a lot, just like Luxembourg, I still believe that it doesn't make sense to give more than what you can actually do. Okay. So it sounds like, Rady, you might find use for both measures because you want to have an understanding of what share or proportion of income is spent, but that ultimately the total dollar amount might be most useful as a gauge or as a measure of generosity. Victor says, I think the pure dollar amount would be more effective, as that is what would allow for greater change in the receiving country. Okay, interesting. So from Victor's perspective, it doesn't actually matter as much what share of the giving country's income is being given. It might matter more the total amount, because relative to the situation on the ground in the receiving country, the total amount might mean more. If, for instance, the receiving country is a poor country and it becomes important for us to give them more rather than less money. Okay, that's a good point too, Victor. Yes, Christiana, do you have a question?
Hi, yeah. Okay, so I'm almost confused as to why we even look at the percentage being given, because I mean, for example, when you make a donation to maybe like a nonprofit, you're not going to enter in, the amount of money you make in a year. I feel like by looking at how much we give by the billion in this case, I think that's what is the most effective, because like typically it's about the amount of money that's going to affect people, and the amount of money given, like the percentage, looking at the percentage isn't going to affect the countries that are receiving the income. The percentage doesn't matter to the other country. I feel like it's about the amount of money that they receive.
Good. In your explanation, Christiana, what you point out is right on, which is that the percentage doesn't contain any information about how large the economy is or how much income the country actually generated, right? So if a country gives, theoretically like 95% of its income as foreign aid, it doesn't mean much if it only generated $100, right? Like the total amount, the volume of the amount given is what matters. That's what becomes effective on the ground as aid. So that resonates with Victor's point. Victor was also thinking about that too, suggesting that, look, aid is about making a difference in the life of the recipient. It's not about, scoring points regarding how much of your or what share of your income you gave. So that's a very good point. And I agree with you. And Christiana, that's a good argument too. If you wanted to make an argument about why the share is less useful as an indicator than the net amount. Very, very good discussion, everybody. I'm glad that you're thinking about this, because these are questions that we'd still discuss and that come up a lot in this literature. And to Christiana's question, why do we even consider the share? Why is the percentage even relevant? Well, it becomes relevant because we define foreign aid as a transfer from one government to another. So because the sending government is really a part of the definition, and because we focus so much on the relationships that arise in foreign aid, it becomes important to consider, what is the circumstance of the sending government? What kind of decision are they making? And it's also important to remember that foreign aid as a proportion of the budget or as a proportion of a government spending, it becomes part of other calculations too. So it's sort of like a data point that we have. Foreign aid gets considered in calculations regarding the capital account and the fiscal balance, and it becomes an indicator that we use for other things. So that's why it is relevant. But it is noteworthy, I think, Christiana, that you point out that when you make like a donation as a private individual, it doesn't get measured in terms of the proportion of your income that you gave. It's just a volume or a total or a net, right? A dollar amount that you give. It could be that that's more or less of your income, but it's not included what proportion of your income that actually is. So that actually is, one obvious difference.
I have another comment / question.
Please go ahead.
Like the recipient country, do they even, I don't want to say care, but does it matter about the percentage a country gives them versus the dollar amount? Because if it's from a not as wealthy country, but their percentage is higher than, let's say, the percentage of the US, what matters more to the recipient rather than the donor?
Yeah, and what matters more probably is the total amount, the dollar amount, and so touche. When it comes down to it, when it comes to the issue of what the foreign aid is meant to do, it probably means more to the receiving country, the total amount, and in that regard, maybe it becomes like an arms race for giving countries if they want to, for example, establish some kind of a relationship with that receiving country. And so, for instance, why does Brazil choose to increase its foreign aid? Why is Brazil giving foreign aid at all? Well, presumably they want to establish more and a different kind of relationship with some countries than, say, Colombia or some other country in Latin America that might wish to gain some advantage by giving foreign aid in a larger quantity than, say, Brazil, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of considerations, and you'll see as we go along that the politics and the interests in the stakeholders are many. And as in anything else, there is a political economy of aid, and those interests and those choices made by actors are not made in a vacuum. And it becomes really interesting for us to think about, well, what are the reasons that countries choose to give, and how does aid become beneficial for the sender? Does it become beneficial for the receiver? And more broadly, and we'll get back to this question eventually, does foreign aid promote economic growth? And can foreign aid buy development? Can foreign aid promote growth in those cases where other strategies were not successful. Yet again, we're coming back to this original question, which is what fosters and what promotes development and what promotes growth in those places that lag behind or where development is delayed. And in the case of the United States, the agency primarily responsible for distributing US foreign assistance targeted at promoting development or growth, in addition to any number of other objectives that might include military or non-military objectives, is USAID, or the United States Agency for International Development. This is the agency and the acronym that you see most often in conjunction with foreign aid. Most foreign aid that flows from the United States comes from this agency, although not all of it. Some foreign aid comes from other agencies. But this agency's transfers are categorized under ODA, or official development assistance. And USAID is the entity and the institution that we primarily think about and understand in our context. So you've undoubtedly seen photos and you've seen representations of this entity before. And we'll stop right now and take a look at USAID to get a sense of, of what the organization is all about. And we'll let it speak for itself. With that said, there's a little bit of propaganda in here because it's a promotional video, but I do think that they give you a pretty good idea what they're up to.
Hi, I'm Amy Batson. I'm the DA for Global Health.
Administrator, managing
My name is Jessica Duraco, and I'm the Communications.
My name is James Fleming.
Hi, my name is Romy Bhatia.
I am proud to work at USAID because we're ensuring clean water.
Because we're building strong economies.
Because we're keeping kids safe from diseases. Because we are working to prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS. Promoting gender equality and empowering women.
We're helping people grow healthy crops because we provide help when disasters strike.
We're supporting groundbreaking research around the world to improve lives. Because we're promoting and facilitating fair elections.
We're protecting the environment through innovative economic growth.
I am proud to work at USAID because we are supporting entrepreneurship.
Because we are providing girls with expanded opportunity and a brighter future through education.
Because we're helping democracy work.
My name is Winston Allen, and I'm proud to work at USAID because they are doing the most good to the most people at their greatest time of need.
I'm proud to work at USAID. I'm proud to work at USAID.
So that's just a bit of a briefer on USAID. Before we go, let me read one more comment from Victor, who says, what if the giving country has higher expectations with the money given compared to another country who gives the same amount, but with a less percentage of income? May receiving countries rather obtain money from countries giving a smaller percentage of their income? It's possible, Victor, that countries might have a preference, but I think that ultimately countries in need of foreign aid might not fuss about the particularities regarding what proportion of the sending country's income is being given as foreign aid. It's that old saying, beggars can't be choosers, right? Or those in need are often happy with what they get, so to speak. And so I think that the politics of this, it does play out in a variety of ways, but I think that, as many of you suggested, when it comes down to it, foreign aid might be more meaningful in terms of the total dollar amount for those countries who need that foreign aid. And we made a number of points that suggested that and supported that. Hey, everybody, we're done for today, but we'll pick up on Wednesday and continue discussing this topic. We've got a lot more where this came from. Thanks for being so engaged today. It's very good to see you. Welcome back, and I'll see you on Wednesday.